The staff, quote, "My aim was to do something good," end quote. For most of their history, residential schools were staffed by individuals who were recruited by Christian missionary organizations. Generally, the churches appointed a priest or minister, as opposed to an educator as the principal. The Roman Catholic schools could draw staff from a number of Catholic religious orders whose members had made explicit vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity. In the spirit of those vows, they would be obliged to go where they were sent, would not expect payment, and would have no families to support. Indian Commissioner David Laird believed that since members of Roman Catholic religious orders received very little in exchange for their services, the Roman Catholic schools could afford to have a much larger staff than where ordinary salaries are paid, and there is consequently less work for each to do without interfering with the quality of the work done, end quote. The Protestant schools recruited many of their staff members through missionary organizations. Many of the early school staff members believed they were participating in a moral crusade. In her History of the McDougall Orphanage, the predecessor of the Morley School in Alberta, Mrs. J. McDougall, described the work of the mission and orphanage as going out after the wild and ignorant and bringing them into a Christian home and blessing the body, culturing the mind, and trying to raise spiritual vision, end quote. Staff members were often motivated by a spirit of adventure as well as a religious commitment. As a young seminary student in Corsica, a French island in the Mediterranean, Nicola Coccola wanted more than a life as a priest. In his memoir he wrote, quote, "The desire of foreign missions with the hope of martyrdom appeared to me as a higher calling," end quote. He ended up living out his life as a residential school principal in British Columbia. As a small boy in England in the middle of the 19th century, Gibbon Stockin read with enthusiasm the missionary literature sent to him by an aunt. When he turned 17, he volunteered his services to the Anglican Church Missionary Society. He hoped to be sent to India. Instead, he was offered a position on the Blackfoot Reserve in what is now southern Alberta. British-born nurse and midwife Margaret Butcher managed to get to India, where she worked for a British family. From there, she made her way to British Columbia, where she worked with a Methodist mission to Japanese immigrants. In 1916, she was on her way to a job at the Methodist Residential School in Kitimat, British Columbia. This mix of motivations continued throughout the system's history. Lorraine Arbez, who worked at the Coppell School in the 1950s, said, quote, "I chose this career to work with the children, and my aim was to do something good with them, and I hope I was of some use," end quote. For Noreen Fishbush, who worked at schools in Ontario and Alberta in the 1950s and 1960s, the residential schools offered much-needed experience. Quote, "As far as I was concerned, it was a teaching job. It was with the kids, and I liked the kids. The kids were getting an education, I had a job," end quote. George Takashima, who taught at Sioux Lookout, explained, "I was just sort of adventuresome, you might say." Almost all the members were poorly paid. Government officials took the position that because many of the staff members belonged to missionary organizations, pay was a minor consideration. As a result, the schools had problems recruiting and keeping staff. Alexander Sutherland of the Methodist Church was particularly outspoken about the link between low wages and the difficulties the schools had in recruiting staff. In 1887, he wrote to the Minister of Indian Affairs about the, quote, "difficulty of obtaining efficient and properly qualified teachers on account of the meager salaries paid," end quote. The issue of low pay never went away. More than a half-century later, in 1948, C.H. Birdsall, the chair of the United Church Committee responsible for the Edmonton School, complained that it, quote, "is impossible for the residential school to offer salaries in competition with," end quote, rates that Indian Affairs was paying teachers at day schools. Given the inadequate quality of accommodation, equipment, and staff at the school, He felt that it was, quote, doubtful the present work with Indian children could properly be called education. Many of the Catholic schools survived on what amounted to volunteer labor. In 1948, Seashelt Principal H.F. Dunlop informed Ottawa, quote, if this school kept out of the red during the past year, it was largely due to the fact that the 4 oblates working here full-time received in salaries from January 1947 to January 1948 the grand total of $1,800, end quote. As late as 1960, the nuns at the Christie Island School were being paid $50 a month, a fact that made Principal A. Noonan feel like a heel. Many qualified and experienced people worked in the schools. Miss Assan, the matron at the Kitimat School in 1930, was a graduate of the Ensworth Deaconess Hospital in St. Joseph, Missouri. She had also trained as a deaconess in Toronto and worked in China from 1909 to 1927. The matron at the Anglican Wabasca, Alberta School in 1933 was a nurse. Among the staff at the Norway House School in the early 20th century were the sisters Charlotte Amelia and Lillian Yeomans. Charlotte had trained as a nurse, and Lillian was one of the first women in Canada to qualify as a doctor. Teresa Reed had 4 years of teaching experience and a teaching certificate before she applied to work at Norway House. George Takashima had a teaching certificate, and Olive Saunders had a university degree and several years of teaching experience. In 1966, E.O. Druin, the principal of the Roman Catholic School in Cardston, boasted that out of the 21 people on his staff, 10 had university degrees. Druin himself had left his position as a university professor to go to work at the school. A number of people devoted their adult lives to working in residential schools. At least 12 principals died in office. Cooper Island principal George Don Kelly resigned in January 1907. By June of that year, he was dead. Sherman Shepherd served at the Anglican schools in Shingle Point on the Arctic Ocean in the Yukon, Aklavik, Northwest Territories, Fort George, Quebec, and Moose Factory, Ontario, resigning in 1954 after 25 years of service in northern Canada. Others worked into their old age, since due to low pay, their savings were also low and pensions were minimal. When the 73-year-old matron of the Ahusat School in British Columbia retired in 1929, Principal W.M. Wood recommended that she be given an honorarium of a month's salary as appreciation for her years of service. Woods noted that she was, quote, retiring with very limited means, end quote. Such long service was not the norm. Because the pay was often low and the working and living conditions were difficult, turnover was high throughout the system's history. From 1882 to 1894, there was what amounted to an annual full turnover of teachers at the Fort Simpson, now Port Simpson, British Columbia School. At one point, the teaching was being done by the local Methodist missionary Thomas Crosby, his wife Emma, and the school matron. Between January 1958 and March 1960, a period of just over 2 years, the Alert Bay School lost 58 staff members. Of these, 19 had been fired because they were deemed to be incompetent. 8 others left because they were angry with the principal. In 1958, the Benedictine sisters announced that their order would no longer be providing the Christie, British Columbia School with staff from its monastery in Mount Angel, Oregon. According to the prioress of the Benedictine monastery, Mother Mary Gemma, meeting residential school needs had left the members of the order physically and mentally exhausted. One of my youngest teachers, quote, "One of my youngest teachers had to have shock treatments this year, and 2 others may have to," end quote. In the previous 2.5 years, the order had lost 14 teachers. These examples are confirmed by the overall statistics. The average annual turnover rate for all Indian Affairs schools from 1956 to 57 to 1963-64 was 25%. The schools were heavily dependent on female labor. The The Roman Catholics relied on female religious orders to staff and operate the residential schools. The Protestants were equally reliant upon the underpaid work of female staff. Austin McKittrick, the principal of the Presbyterian school at Shoal Lake in northwestern Ontario, acknowledged this when he wrote in 1901, quote, "I think if we men were to put ourselves in the places of some overworked, tired out women, we would perhaps not stand it so patiently as they often do," end quote. One missionary wrote that, knowing what he did about what was expected of female missionaries, he would discourage any daughter of his from working for the Methodist Women's Missionary Society. Although women usually worked in subordinate roles, the 1906 Indian Affairs Annual Report listed 11 female principals. All worked at boarding schools as opposed to industrial schools. 7 of them were Roman Catholic, 2 were Anglican, 1 was Methodist, and 1 was Presbyterian. One of these principals was Kate Gillespie. After teaching at day schools on reserves near Kamsack and Prince Albert, she was appointed principal of the File Hill School in 1901, a position she held until her marriage in 1908. The schools employed many more people than principals and teachers. Most schools were mini communities. There were cooks, seamstresses, housekeepers, matrons, disciplinarians, farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, engineers to operate the heating and electrical generators, shoemakers, and even bandmasters. Smaller schools such as the United Church Crosby Girls' Home in Port Simpson, British Columbia, made do with a staff of only 3 people in 1935. The Roman Catholic school at Kamloops, British Columbia had at least 19 staff in the same year. The Prince Albert, Saskatchewan residence had over 50 employees during the 1966-67 school year. Workloads were heavy and time off was rare. The 7-day week was the norm for many employees. An 1896 report on the Mount Elgin School noted, quote, "No holidays are given or allowed to the staff. All days or parts of days lost time are deducted from their wages," end quote. The policy at the Anglican schools into the 1920s was to allow 1 full day off duty each month. Indian agent F.J.C. Ball predicted that a 63-year-old employee of the Lytton School was headed for a nervous breakdown in 1922. According to Ball, the man was, quote, "acting as teacher, minister, janitor, and general handyman around the school. He also has charge of the boys' dormitory at night," end quote. Staff meals were generally superior to those provided to the students. Staff members, particularly in the early years of the system, had greater immunity than their students to many of the diseases that plagued residential schools. Despite this, the living conditions that prevailed in many schools took a toll on staff. In 1896, E.B. Glass, the principal of the Whitefish Lake School in what is now Alberta, said the deterioration in the health of one staff member was the result of having to work in an inadequately heated and poorly insulated schoolhouse in which the cold wind whistled up through the floor. Glass said that, quote, "The department which charges itself with building, repairing, and furnishing schoolhouses should also charge itself with neglect and the suffering endured by the teacher from that neglect," end quote. Disease and illness also claimed the children of married staff members. Emma Crosby, who helped found the Crosby Girls' Home in Port Simpson in the late 1870s, buried 4 of her children at Port Simpson. 2 of them had succumbed to diphtheria. Elizabeth Matheson, the wife of the Onion Lake principal, lost a daughter to whooping cough and a son to meningeal croup in the early years of the 20th century. During her 4th pregnancy, Elizabeth Matheson was so depressed that she considered suicide. Missionary staff, particularly in the early years of the system, were extremely hostile to Aboriginal culture. They commonly described Aboriginal people as lazy. The longtime principal of the Shubenacadie School in Nova Scotia, J.P. McKay, was expressing these views in the 1930s. In one letter, he described Aboriginal people as natural liars. Quote, "For myself, I never hope to catch up with the Indian and his lies, and in fact I'm not going to try." End quote. Others, however, spoke out on behalf of Aboriginal people. Hugh Mackay, the superintendent of Presbyterian missionary work among Aboriginal people, criticized the federal government for failing to implement its treaty promises and for failing to alleviate the hunger crisis on the prairies. Similarly, William Duncan, the Anglican missionary at Metlakatla, British Columbia, advised the Tsimshian on how to advance arguments in favor of Aboriginal title. Sometimes staff protested the way students were treated. When 2 staff members of the Prince Albert, Saskatchewan school resigned in 1952, they complained of the harsh disciplinary regime at the school. In 1957, Helen Clafton, an ex-dormitory supervisor, wrote of how at the Lytton, British Columbia school, quote, "the strap is altogether too much in evidence."